No one in the tryout room believed Nolan Vance belonged beside men half his age. His suit was outdated, his shoes were worn thin, and his personnel file was nearly empty. Behind his back, they called him the washed-up father who had wandered into the wrong building. CEO Brielle Hawthorne watched in silence, as the unbeaten champion Dax Hollister swore he would leave Nolan crawling off the mat before lunch. But when the clock started, Nolan slipped one strike, locked one joint, and dropped the champion in exactly 3 seconds flat. What terrified Brielle was not the victory. It was the black mark she glimpsed beneath his sleeve. Hawthorne Dynamics had opened its private security tryouts on a gray morning in Denver, Colorado, searching for a single executive protection officer to guard its chief executive. More than 30 candidates filled the training floor that day, most of them former soldiers, federal agents, or professional fighters with polished resumes and confident jaws. Dax Hollister stood at the center of the crowd, the way a champion always does, unbeaten in 41 internal matches and openly favored by the head of security, Colter Briggs. When Nolan walked in wearing a jacket that had clearly seen better winters, carrying no medals, no service photographs, and no list of accomplishments, a ripple of quiet laughter followed him across the room. One candidate glanced at the family status line on the sign-in sheet and muttered that Hawthorne Dynamics must be desperate, since apparently even single fathers looking for a desk job were welcome now. Dax laughed loudest of all, telling the room that guarding a chief executive was not a job for a man who had spent years changing diapers and making dinner instead of staying sharp. Nolan said nothing. He simply looked around the room the way a man reads a room he intends to survive, and in 4 seconds he had already noticed a security camera tilted 2 degrees off its mount, an emergency exit blocked by an unattended cart, 2 technicians swiping badges the wrong color for their clearance level, and a training pistol, with its safety mechanism installed backward. Other candidates paid no attention to any of it, more interested in trading stories about deployments and championships than in reading the room they were standing in. A former military police officer bragged loudly about a stint providing security for traveling executives overseas, insisting that guarding a technology executive would be far easier work than anything he had done before. A retired boxer flexed for a cluster of onlookers, promising he could end any confrontation before it truly began. Nolan ignored all of it quietly, counting the number of unarmed staff members working within reach of the blocked exit, a habit that had nothing to do with impressing anyone in the room, and everything to do with instinct he had never fully switched off. Colter watched him from across the floor with visible irritation, unable to place exactly why a man with an empty file made him uneasy. Brielle stood behind a pane of one-way glass above the training floor, arms folded, watching candidates the way she watched everything else in her company, with a patience that revealed nothing. She noticed that Nolan never looked at his opponents the way the others did. He looked at doors. He looked at angles. He looked at the places a threat would come from, rather than the people standing in front of him, and that alone separated him from every other applicant in the building. Colter leaned toward her and suggested cutting Nolan immediately, citing an incomplete file and a gap in employment history that stretched back more than a decade. Brielle told him to leave the washed-up father exactly where he was, since he was the only candidate in the entire room who had noticed the blocked exit before the drill even began. When the first evaluation started, Nolan walked past the training pistol assigned to him and quietly corrected its safety mechanism before ever raising it, a small motion that almost no one in the room registered, except the woman watching from above. Dax rolled his eyes and told anyone nearby that the old man was clearly performing for the cameras, trying to look competent instead of being competent, and that performances like that never survived contact with someone who actually knew how to fight. He stepped onto the center of the mat, pointed directly at Nolan, and announced to the entire floor that he would personally be the one to send the washed-up father home before the day was finished. The evaluations that followed were built to look fair while being anything but, and within an hour Nolan understood exactly how rigged they were. Candidates were tested on simulated marksmanship, ambush response, and escorting a target through a crowded corridor, and Dax scored highest in every category, arriving at each obstacle with an ease that suggested he already knew where the danger would appear before it did. Nolan fired fewer rounds than almost anyone on the floor, yet he consistently moved his assigned target to a secured position faster than every other candidate, choosing efficiency over spectacle every single time. During the crowd evaluation, when the scenario called for pushing a role-playing bystander to the ground to clear a path, Nolan refused, instead repositioning his own body, using his shoulders and forearms to redirect the crowd without ever laying a hand on the person meant to be protected. Coulter docked points for the delay, insisting that hesitation in the field cost lives and that Nolan had been too slow, too cautious, and too unwilling to commit to decisive force. Brielle disagreed out loud for the first time that day, reminding Coulter that the objective of protection was to bring the principal home safely, not to count how many bystanders could be knocked down along the way. During the ambush evaluation that followed, actors dressed as maintenance workers rushed the corridor from two directions at once, a scenario designed to overwhelm candidates who could only track a single threat at a time. Most candidates froze for a critical half-second, uncertain which direction demanded the greater response, and lost points accordingly. Nolan solved the dilemma by placing his body between Brielle's stand-in and the more immediate threat, while using his voice alone to redirect two nearby staff members toward blocking the second approach, turning bystanders into an improvised extension of his own protection rather than problems to be managed. It was a technique none of the evaluators had ever seen a candidate attempt before, and even Coulter, however, reluctantly made a note of it on his clipboard. It was during this exchange that Nolan noticed something the judges had missed entirely. Dax was receiving directional cues through a small earpiece tuned to a private frequency, feeding him the location of every scripted threat seconds before it appeared. Rather than expose it immediately, Nolan simply adjusted his own route through the corridor, quietly rerouting around wherever Dax's earpiece told him danger would come from next. Brielle chose to step directly into the final evaluation herself, walking into the corridor as the live target for the last scenario, a decision none of the other executives on the floor had ever made before. When a simulated explosion detonated to her left, every candidate in the corridor turned instinctively toward the sound, including Dax, who pivoted a full half-second too late. Nolan had already pulled Brielle in the opposite direction, away from a second simulated firing line, positioned exactly where a trained eye would expect a real ambush to strike, once the crowd's attention had been hijacked by the first blast. He explained afterward without drama that the noise was only ever bait, and that anyone truly dangerous waited patiently for the crowd to look the wrong way before making their move. Brielle asked him quietly where a man learned something like that, and Nolan answered simply that he had learned it somewhere. A single wrong glance could mean someone else never made it home. Coulter's expression hardened the moment he heard it, and from that point forward, he began treating Nolan less like a curious outlier and more like a genuine problem to be solved. Dax, humiliated in front of the woman his career depended on impressing quietly, demanded a direct rematch, and Coulter, sensing an opportunity to remove Nolan, permanently rewrote the elimination bracket to force the two men into a head-to-head final. Before that final began, Nolan stepped away to take a short call from his daughter Tessa, now 25 years old, and living several states away, building a career of her own in industrial design. Tessa's voice on the line was warm but firm, the voice of a young woman who had grown up watching her father sacrifice everything for her after her mother's death, and who was tired of watching him hide from a life he was clearly built for. She reminded him that she was no longer a child who needed protecting every hour of every day, and that he did not have to keep shrinking himself into safer, quieter jobs just to stay close to home. Nolan told her he was only looking for ordinary work, nothing more complicated than a paycheck and a routine. Tessa answered that they both knew exactly what he was really looking for, and it was not a paycheck. It was the version of himself he had buried the day he decided fatherhood and danger could not exist in the same life. Moments later, the screen across the training floor lit up with a single line that silenced the remaining candidates: Nolan Vance versus Dax Hollister elimination final. The entire floor gathered around the mat as the final match was announced, and Coulter declared that this bout would end only when one man surrendered, or could no longer continue, a rule far more severe than the standard controlled format used earlier that day. Nolan calmly requested a return to the normal submission rules, hoping to avoid unnecessary injury. But Dax laughed the request off, telling the crowd that Nolan was already building his excuse for losing before the clock had even started. He reminded everyone that his record stood at 41 straight victories, and promised he would end this one in under 30 seconds, a boast that drew scattered applause from candidates eager to see the newcomer humbled. Brielle noticed that Nolan did not stretch, did not clench his fists, and barely altered his breathing at all, while Dax paced and postured across from him. Just before the clock started, Nolan offered one quiet warning, telling Dax that raw power meant very little once an opponent had already read his intentions. Dax scoffed and lunged forward the instant the timer began, throwing his familiar opening right hand, before transitioning into the hip throw that had ended 41 previous matches without failure. Nolan stepped diagonally off the line of attack, redirected Dax's shoulder with his forearm, secured a lock across the wrist and elbow, and used the momentum of Dax's own charge to drive him down onto the mat, the entire sequence completed before the timer had counted past 3 full seconds. He stopped the pressure just short of dislocating the shoulder, resting one knee beside Dax's body without ever pressing down on his throat or chest, a level of restraint that unsettled the room even more than the speed of the takedown itself. The silence that followed was so complete that the timer's mechanical voice announcing 3 seconds was the only sound anyone in the building could hear. Nolan released Dax immediately and extended a hand to help him back to his feet, an act of decency that seemed to embarrass Dax more than the loss itself had. Furious and humiliated, Dax attempted a surprise attack from behind, only to find that Nolan, without even turning around, had already stepped clear of the strike, calmly informing him that a second attempt would not be treated as a test anymore. Dax froze, finally understanding that Nolan had anticipated every movement he was capable of making before he had made it. It was in the middle of that final lock that Nolan's sleeve rode up his forearm, and Brielle, watching from behind the glass, saw the tattoo etched into his skin, a black shield split into 9 fractured pieces. She recognized the symbol instantly because she had seen it once before, buried inside a classified file that had belonged to her own father. It was the emblem of Aegis 9, an elite protection unit rumored to have been quietly dissolved after a catastrophic mission gone wrong more than a decade earlier. Its final commanding officer's name scrubbed from every surviving stash. Record. Brielle stood frozen behind the glass, piecing together the resume gap, the tactical instincts, the refusal to use unnecessary force, and the tattoo now exposed on a man the rest of the room had dismissed as a washed-up single father. She ordered the training floor cleared immediately, leaving only Nolan behind, and once the door sealed shut, she placed an old classified folder on the table between them and addressed him by a name that had not been spoken aloud in 12 years. She called him Warden. Brielle explained that her father had been protected by Aegis 9 12 years earlier, saved from a coordinated attack during a period when he was preparing to testify against a group of executives selling classified defense technology on the black market. The declassified summary described Warden as the operative capable of moving an entire convoy through a hostile perimeter without losing the principal under protection, language that matched everything she had just watched Nolan do on the training floor. Nolan neither confirmed nor denied the name, instead asking why she still possessed a document that should have been destroyed years earlier. Brielle told him her father had kept it locked in a private safe, along with a handwritten note instructing her to find the man they had betrayed. The moment she said the word betrayed, something in Nolan's posture changed, the calm control replaced by a colder more guarded stillness. He told her that the final mission of Aegis 9 had failed because their protected route had been sold to the very people meant to be intercepted, and that Coulter Briggs, then a junior operations coordinator, had supplied the falsified data that sent Nolan's convoy directly into the ambush. In the investigation that followed, Nolan was blamed for altering the route himself, stripped of clearance, and forced to disappear entirely from any official record. At almost the exact same time, his wife had died from a long illness, leaving him to raise Tessa alone, and rather than spend years fighting to clear a name that no one wanted cleared, he chose to disappear into fatherhood instead. Brielle asked why he had finally decided to come back into a world that had discarded him so completely. Nolan answered that his daughter was grown now, and she had told him plainly that she could not learn to live courageously while watching her own father spend his life in hiding. Brielle offered him the position of lead protection officer on the spot, but Nolan declined the title, agreeing instead to a 30-day trial contract with 3 conditions attached. He wanted full access to audit the entire security system from the ground up, a guarantee that no threat information would ever be withheld from him, regardless of who tried to withhold it, and the authority to alter Brielle's schedule the instant he identified a credible danger. Brielle agreed without hesitation, overruling Coulter's loud objections, and Dax found himself reassigned to the protection team, now reporting directly to the very man who had defeated him in 3 seconds. Rather than mock Dax, the way he had been mocked, Nolan simply told him that real strength meant learning to protect other people, instead of protecting his own pride. Within his first hours inside the security office, Nolan discovered that a single senior-level access badge had been duplicated 7 separate times, each copy used to enter the executive floor on nights matching threats previously received by Brielle. The original badge belonged to an employee who had resigned 6 months earlier, yet someone with authority over the access logs had been quietly erasing the digital trail behind every unauthorized entry, and only Coulter possessed that level of clearance. Before Nolan could bring the discovery to Brielle directly, someone inside the building photographed him alone in the security office and sent the image to Marlowe Prescott, the company's vice chair, along with a short message warning that Warden had returned. Coulter announced an unscheduled evacuation drill only days later, and Nolan immediately objected, pointing out that the drill's timing had already leaked into the shared internal calendar where any determined attacker could easily read it. Coulter dismissed the concern and proceeded regardless, and the moment the fire alarm sounded, every elevator in the building locked automatically. While Dax's team escorted Brielle toward the designated eastern stairwell, exactly as protocol required, Nolan noticed the smoke drifting against the direction of the ventilation airflow, and concluded within seconds that it was not smoke from any fire at all, but a disorienting agent released deliberately into the stairwell. He demanded an immediate change of route, but Dax, still following Coulter's direct orders, continued down the assigned path regardless of the warning. Guests and staff scattered throughout the building reacted to the alarm exactly as any untrained crowd would, funneling toward the nearest marked exits, without questioning why every possible route seemed to converge on the same narrow stairwell. Nolan understood that predictable behavior was precisely what made ordinary evacuation drills so easy to weaponize, since anyone planning an ambush needed only to study the building's exit signage in advance. He kept Brielle moving against the grain of the crowd, rather than with it, aware that a determined attacker would always expect the target to follow the herd. Dax, still several steps behind, radioed for backup, only to discover the internal channel had already gone completely silent, cut off at the exact moment the alarm first sounded. A small drone appeared inside the stairwell, carrying a compact device designed to deliver an electrical charge, and Nolan smothered its camera with his jacket before slamming it against the concrete wall, disabling it instantly. The fire doors sealed automatically behind them, cutting Brielle off from most of her protection detail, and Nolan guided her instead through a maintenance corridor after shutting down the ventilation system that had been carrying the disorienting agent. 2 men, posing as emergency responders, approached them shortly after, and Nolan noticed their boots carried no dust, despite claiming to have just come through a burning upper floor, a detail that gave away the deception instantly. He neutralized both men with short, controlled movements, careful not to cause lasting harm, while Dax watched from a distance, seeing for the first time exactly how Nolan protected someone without ever losing his composure. A third attacker attempted to strike Brielle with an electrical device, and this time Dax reacted in time, using a defensive shield technique Nolan had taught him only hours earlier to protect her successfully. It marked the first real turning point in Dax's journey, the moment his instincts shifted from proving his own dominance toward genuinely protecting someone else. Nolan recovered a military-grade signal transmitter from the attackers, and when he examined it later, he found it had been activated using an internal access code belonging to the security department itself. Coulter insisted the attackers were simply hired actors who had exceeded the boundaries of the scripted drill, but Nolan pointed out that actors did not carry live weapons or disappear entirely from the official participant roster. Brielle ordered the building placed on immediate lockdown, and it was in that tense quiet that Marlowe arrived, appearing shaken, gently suggesting that Brielle step back from her role temporarily for the sake of the shareholders. Nolan quietly thanked Dax for saving Brielle, rather than taking credit for the operation himself, a gesture that left Dax looking at him with something close to genuine respect for the first time since they had met. Later that night, Nolan decoded the recovered transmitter fully, and found a signal pattern nearly identical to the one used against his own convoy 12 years earlier, confirming that whoever orchestrated tonight's attack was connected to the same conspiracy that had destroyed his reputation more than a decade before. Brielle led him into her late father's private archive the following morning, a room few people inside the company even knew existed, filled with financial records, old convoy routes, and audio recordings that had never been made public. The documents revealed that 12 years earlier, her father had been preparing to testify against a group of company leaders, secretly selling defense technology to unauthorized buyers, and Aegis 9 had been assigned to deliver him safely to that federal hearing. The secure route had been leaked in advance. The convoy ambushed several members of the unit wounded, and the witness meant to provide the damning evidence disappeared without a trace before the hearing ever took place. The recordings inside the archive included a shaken voicemail left by Brielle's father only hours after the ambush, thanking an unnamed protector for pulling him from a burning vehicle before the second wave of gunfire arrived. Financial statements stacked beside the audio files traced a pattern of shell companies used to funnel classified schematics overseas. The same companies later dissolved the moment the federal hearing was quietly canceled for lack of a witness. Brielle read through page after page in silence, watching 12 years of assumptions about her own father unravel in real time. She had grown up believing he simply retired early for health reasons, never once suspecting he had spent his final working years trying to expose the very board members who later helped steer his company's fortune. Nolan had gotten Brielle's father out alive that day, yet he was accused of altering the route himself, and a previously unheard recording now proved he had only changed course after receiving a falsified order carrying Coulter's authentication code. Brielle's father had known the truth all along, but had been pressured by the board into silence, choosing to protect the company's reputation instead of the man who had actually saved his life. Brielle, overwhelmed with guilt at learning her own family had quietly benefited from Nolan's ruined name, apologized to him immediately. Though Nolan made clear that an apology could not return the years he had spent living under an identity that no longer officially existed. He admitted, however, that raising Tessa alone had kept him from becoming a man consumed entirely by bitterness, and that he did not regret choosing his daughter over his own reputation. Brielle promised to release the evidence publicly once the immediate danger had passed, but Nolan warned that revealing it too soon would give whoever was still protecting the conspiracy every reason to destroy the remaining proof before it could ever be used. They agreed to appear as though nothing had been found, and Nolan quietly planted 3 separate decoy files across different servers, each one listing a slightly different version of Brielle's upcoming schedule, designed to reveal exactly which insider was leaking information. Within hours, a new threat appeared at the location listed only in the file sent privately to Coulter, giving Nolan the confirmation he needed that Coulter was the source of the leak. Before he could bring the evidence to Brielle, security personnel discovered a firearm and encrypted data hidden inside Nolan's own locker evidence, carefully staged to make him appear responsible for orchestrating the entire series of attacks. Coulter ordered Nolan detained in front of the full protection team, and as he was led away, Brielle coldly told him she had been wrong to trust him, though her eyes flicked briefly toward the very security camera Nolan had insisted on installing days earlier. News that Nolan had been arrested spread through Hawthorne Dynamics within the hour, and the same people who had watched him win in 3 seconds now whispered that the victory had only ever been a performance meant to earn access to the chief executive. Coulter reclaimed full control of the security division almost immediately, while Marlowe pushed hard for an emergency board vote to suspend Brielle from her own company. Brielle's public silence convinced most of the staff that she had chosen to protect the corporation over defending the man who had twice saved her life, and even Nolan, sitting alone in an internal interrogation room, began to wonder whether she had finally abandoned him as well. He did not resist detention, understanding that Coulter wanted him to run since an escape would only confirm his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Dax was assigned to guard the very man he had once mocked, and Nolan asked him quietly whether he genuinely believed someone capable of ending a fight in 3 seconds would be careless enough to hide incriminating evidence inside an unlocked locker. Doubt crept into Dax's expression, and later that night, he reviewed old security footage on his own, noticing that the person who had planted the firearm walked with the exact same gait as one of Coulter's closest subordinates. He discovered a 17-second gap hidden inside the official camera log, proof that the entire recording had been quietly altered to remove any trace of the real culprit. When Dax confronted Coulter directly, he was ordered instead to focus entirely on securing an upcoming shareholder gala, with Coulter dangling the promise of Dax's old position back in exchange for his continued silence. Faced with a choice between the career he had always wanted and doing what was right, Dax chose to return to the detention room, unlock the door, and tell Nolan this was not an apology, only a chance to finally uncover the truth. Nolan refused to run, instead asking Dax to restore the original footage and send it directly to Brielle without delay, which was when it became clear that Brielle's cold declaration of being wrong had never been sincere at all. It had been a prearranged signal between them, a coded phrase, meaning the plan had been compromised, and it was time to move to the contingency they had quietly discussed days earlier. Using her authority as chief executive, Brielle had already delayed Nolan's formal transfer to outside authorities, buying just enough time for the three of them to begin working together in secret. The looming shareholder gala could not be cancelled without giving Marlowe the exact excuse she needed to force an emergency vote, and Nolan soon discovered that the catering staff scheduled for that evening had been swapped out at the very last moment. A convoy carrying forged federal credentials was already en route to the building, and it became clear that the true objective was no longer to kill Brielle, but to force her in front of several hundred witnesses to sign away control of the entire company. Every light inside Hawthorne Dynamics went dark. The instant Brielle stepped onto the stage to address the crowd of gathered shareholders, and the building's backup power failed to engage. Automated security doors sealed shut across multiple floors, splitting hundreds of guests into isolated groups throughout the darkened building. A team dressed in federal jackets moved through the lobby, announcing that Brielle was being detained on suspicion of selling classified defense technology, though Nolan immediately noticed their badges were positioned incorrectly for genuine agents. Dax tried to trigger the manual alarm, but the signal had already been blocked, and Marlowe, pretending to be frightened, urged Brielle to cooperate quietly to avoid any unnecessary violence, a suggestion that finally confirmed for Brielle exactly who had orchestrated everything from the beginning. Panic spread quickly through the ballroom as investors and board members realized the exits nearest the stage had already sealed shut, trapping roughly 200 guests inside a room, lit only by the pale emergency strips along the floor. A few tried forcing the doors open manually, while others reached for their phones only to discover every signal inside the building had been jammed the moment the power failed. Dax worked room by room, calming frightened guests and organizing them along the walls farthest from the entrance, buying precious time while he searched for a way to restore the ventilation override manually from the technical floor below. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind that offered no glory and no audience, exactly the kind of work Nolan had spent days quietly teaching him to value over the desire to be seen as a hero. Nolan moved through the same maintenance corridors he had memorized on his very first day, guiding Dax to lead the remaining guests into a reinforced conference room built to withstand exactly this kind of siege. He reached the main stage by triggering the fire suppression system, using the resulting mist to obscure his approach, and pulled Brielle away from the fake federal team before Coulter finally blocked their path. Coulter openly admitted he had sold out the Aegis 9 convoy 12 years earlier, calling Nolan the perfect man to take the blame, since he was too principled to expose the mission's secrets even to save his own reputation. He taunted Nolan about the quiet, hidden years he had been forced to live, hoping to provoke a mistake, and for a moment, Nolan had a clear opportunity to subdue him completely. Instead, hearing Brielle cry out behind him, Nolan abandoned the chance entirely and turned back toward her, proving once again that protecting the person in front of him always outweighed any desire for personal revenge. Coulter fled toward the loading area, while Dax found himself facing 3 armed mercenaries alone, and rather than charge in recklessly, the way he once would have applied everything Nolan had taught him, he sealed off the corridor to isolate the threat, kept a clear path open for any civilians nearby, and only engaged directly once every other option had been exhausted. Nolan and Brielle finally reached what was supposed to be a secure safe room, only to discover the access code had already been changed, and Nolan realized instantly that Coulter had deliberately herded them there. The room was never meant to protect anyone. It was a staged trap complete with hidden cameras, built specifically to record Brielle being forced to sign away control of her own company. Marlowe's face appeared on a monitor inside the room, calmly announcing that a helicopter was already waiting on the roof, and that unless Brielle signed the transfer documents within 10 minutes, the ventilation system feeding the trapped conference room would be shut off entirely, endangering every guest still inside. Brielle, willing to sacrifice her company if it meant saving hundreds of lives, began reaching for the papers. But Nolan stopped her, warning that people like Marlowe rarely honored agreements once they already had what they wanted in writing. He recognized that the signal controlling the ventilation system had to be broadcast from a short-range transmitter, almost certainly carried aboard the waiting helicopter itself. Nolan devised a plan to walk Brielle up to the rooftop, allowing their enemies to believe they had finally surrendered, while Dax worked to override the ventilation system manually from the building's technical floor below. Setting his weapon down on the floor as a final gesture of apparent submission, Nolan led Brielle up the final stairwell toward the rooftop, where Marlowe and Coulter stood waiting beside the idling helicopter. On the rooftop, Brielle was pressured to sign away her controlling shares, while Marlowe prepared to announce publicly that she had resigned voluntarily following what would be described as a mental health crisis. Coulter leveled a weapon at Nolan and forced him to his knees, intending to film him lunging forward so the footage could brand him as the final undeniable villain of the entire conspiracy. Quietly, Nolan absorbed every detail of the scene around him, the helicopter blades not yet spinning at full speed, the rain-slicked section of rooftop beneath Coulter's boots, the mercenary standing nearby with the signal transmitter clipped to his hip, and the live camera feed Marlowe was already streaming to the boardroom below. Nolan deliberately provoked Coulter, telling him that he had never truly beaten him in any real sense, only a falsified file 12 years earlier, and the insult was enough to make Coulter step forward, breaking the careful formation his own men had built around him. Nolan whispered 2 words to Brielle 3 seconds. She understood immediately that it was the signal they had quietly agreed upon in advance, and the plan unfolded exactly on schedule. In the first second, Brielle hurled a folder of documents directly into Marlowe's camera, blinding the live feed instantly. In the second, Nolan pivoted sideways, wrenching Coulter's wrist away from Brielle's direction. In the third second, he used Coulter's own forward momentum to throw him down and strip the weapon from his hand, an echo of the very takedown that had first exposed him days earlier, except this time the stakes reached far beyond a single training match. The remaining mercenary lunged forward only for Dax to burst from the stairwell and intercept him, tearing the signal transmitter from his hip, and instead of finishing the fight to prove his own strength, immediately hurling the device to Brielle. She entered the override code without hesitation, restoring the ventilation system, and moments later, the building's backup power along with it. Marlowe scrambled desperately toward the helicopter, hoping to escape before authorities could arrive. But Dax was already standing in front of the open door, blocking her path. She insisted there was no proof connecting her to any of it, until Brielle revealed that the small pin fastened to her jacket had actually been a recording device Nolan had given her before the gala ever began. Every confession Coulter had made, and every order Marlowe had given, had already been transmitted to a secure external server, along with the very camera feed Marlowe had intended to use to humiliate Brielle in front of her own board. Federal agents and Denver police arrived within minutes, moving swiftly through the building, as Coulter attempted to draw a hidden blade from his ankle in one final act of desperation. Dax spotted the movement first, but Nolan had already restrained him before the blade ever cleared its sheath, choosing restraint over retaliation even in that final moment. He handed Coulter directly over to the authorities, rather than settling any personal score of his own, and Marlowe was arrested on charges spanning conspiracy, extortion, corporate sabotage, and the deployment of an armed team impersonating federal agents. The data recovered from Coulter ultimately proved that he had forged the very order that sent Nolan's convoy into an ambush 12 years earlier, finally giving Nolan the evidence needed to erase a false accusation he had carried in silence for more than a decade. As officers led him away in handcuffs, Coulter asked bitterly why Nolan had not simply killed him when he had the chance. Nolan answered quietly that he was a protector, not an executioner. Weeks later, a federal investigation formally confirmed the full scope of Marlowe and Coulter's conspiracy, and the board of directors quietly canceled the vote that had once threatened to remove Brielle from the company she had built her entire life around. Hawthorne Dynamics stock recovered once Brielle addressed the public directly and laid out the truth in full, and Nolan's own record was finally corrected, with surviving members of Aegis 9 formally confirming that he had never betrayed the unit at any point. Brielle called a meeting inside the very room where the tryouts had once taken place, gathering the same staff and applicants who had mocked Nolan on his first day. She did not offer him a private apology alone. She stood before the entire room and openly admitted that her family's company had chosen silence over justice 12 years earlier, purely to protect its own reputation. She announced that Hawthorne Dynamics would formally compensate every surviving member of Aegis 9 affected by that decision, beginning with the man they had once called Warden. Brielle offered Nolan a newly created position director of executive protection strategy, granting him full authority to rebuild the entire security division from the ground up. He did not accept immediately, instead laying out 3 conditions of his own before agreeing to anything. Security, he said, existed to serve people, never to serve the ego of whoever happened to be in charge. And no individual achievement would ever be valued above the discipline required to control one's own strength. Every employee, he insisted, deserved the right to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation from anyone above them, regardless of rank. Brielle accepted every condition without hesitation, and Nolan promptly named Dax head of field training, a decision that visibly surprised the younger man, who had assumed Nolan still saw him only as the bully he had once been on that very same mat. Nolan told him plainly that the strength had always been there. What Dax had needed to learn was simply when that strength deserved to be used. Dax offered a public apology for the way he had once mocked Nolan, but Nolan refused to let him kneel over it, asking instead that he help ensure no future applicant would ever again be judged only by their age, their clothing, or their family circumstances. Together, they built a new training program, one they called the 3-second rule, structured around a simple discipline anyone could learn. The first second was for noticing what everyone else overlooked. The second was for choosing exactly who needed protecting. The third second was for acting without ever letting pride take control of the decision. Within a few months, the 3-second rule had spread beyond the protection division, entirely adopted informally by other departments, as a simple standard for handling everyday crises, from a system outage on the trading floor to a delayed shipment threatening a critical defense contract. Employees who once avoided the security office out of fear now brought concerns directly to Nolan's team, confident that a genuine problem would never be buried to protect someone's reputation again. Dax began mentoring candidates the way Nolan had once mentored him, careful never to let a promising applicant walk away simply because their resume looked thinner than someone else's. Even Brielle adjusted the way she ran her own meetings, learning to pause and ask who in the room had noticed something everyone else had missed, rather than simply asking who had offered the loudest answer. Brielle once asked Nolan whether he intended to keep living forever inside the shadow of the man once known as Warden. Nolan told her that Warden had been the man who fought through the darkest years of his past, but Nolan Vance was the man who had lived long enough to finally understand exactly what he was fighting for. He called Tessa that same evening to tell her his name had finally been cleared after 12 long years, and she did not ask him a single question about any promotion or new title. She only asked whether her father had finally stopped running. Nolan looked out over the newly built training floor below him and answered simply that yes, he finally had. Brielle stood nearby, careful not to intrude on the quiet weight of that moment, though the respect in her expression spoke for itself, and the bond between them settled into something steady and trusted rather than rushed toward anything more. At the very next round of tryouts, an older applicant walked in carrying a thin, unremarkable file, and when a few of the younger candidates began to snicker among themselves, Dax cut the laughter short, instantly reminding everyone in the room that no file could ever predict how a person would act inside the 3 seconds that truly mattered. Nolan stood behind the same glass, where Brielle had once watched him for the very first time. And this time, no one in that room dared to mock the man they assumed was too old, too quiet, or too ordinary to matter. He walked past the mat where he had once dropped an unbeaten champion in 3 seconds flat, and on the wall above it hung no photograph of that victory at all, only a single line he had chosen himself. The strongest person is never the one who defeats an opponent fastest, but the one who understands exactly who their strength belongs to. The doors closed quietly behind Nolan as he stepped into the elevator beside Brielle, no longer a man erased from every official record, but a man finally trusted to protect the future of everything the company still had left to build.